The cold wind howled across the glacier mountain, pushing the snow in every direction. The sky was dark and filled with thick, swirling clouds. There was no sign of life on the icy peak, just a desolate, freezing wasteland. Yet amidst the harsh environment, a small figure struggled against the wind, her steps slow and shaky. The alien princess, Eliana, was weak, her body barely able to withstand the storm. Her skin, a pale shade of blue, shone dimly against the white snow, but her strength was fading with each step. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and every move she made felt like it took all of her remaining energy. Aliana had been part of a group traveling to meet with a nearby alien race. But the storm had struck quickly, and the convoy had been scattered. She had tried to keep up with the others, but her injuries from the earlier skirmish and the bitter cold were too much. Now she was lost, alone, and struggling to survive in a world that didn't seem to care for her existence. As the storm grew stronger, Aliana stumbled. Her feet slid beneath her, and she fell to her knees. The snow around her seemed to close in, swallowing her up as the cold bit at her exposed skin. She tried to rise, but her arms wouldn't cooperate. She fell again, her vision blurring as she fought to stay conscious. The cold was overwhelming. Her body felt numb, and she knew her chances of survival were slipping away. She had been taught to be strong, to never show weakness. But right now, there was nothing she could do. She closed her eyes and let the cold take over, thinking that perhaps this was the end. But then, just as her mind began to drift, a faint sound reached her ears. It was the crunch of footsteps in the snow, slow but steady, and they were coming closer. Aliana opened her eyes, blinking against the snowflakes that had begun to fall more heavily. She looked up, struggling to focus. There, through the white haze, a figure appeared, a man, wrapped in thick clothing and moving with purpose. He wasn't part of her convoy, but he was human. She didn't know how he had come to be here, but he was the only thing standing between her and death. The human man stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes scanning the area before locking onto Eliana, looked surprised, but also cautious. He had likely seen many things in his time on this planet, but finding a weak, helpless alien princess stranded in the snow was clearly unexpected. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Alina's breath came in shallow bursts, and she could see the man's brow furrow as he assessed her. She was too weak to stand, too exhausted to try. "You shouldn't be out here," the human said, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't spoken much lately. Aliana tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and only a faint cough escaped her lips. The human stepped closer, his movements careful but firm. He bent down, offering a hand to help her up, though he didn't seem to expect her to take it. Aliana stared at the hand for a long moment, uncertain. Her pride told her to stand on her own, but her body was too weak to listen. With a quiet sigh, she took his hand. The warmth of his grip was a sharp contrast to the cold that had been numbing her. She let out a soft breath, leaning into him as he helped her stand. "You're not from here," the human said as he supported her weight. "How did you end up on this mountain?" Alina's mind was foggy, her thoughts scattered. She struggled to recall the events that had brought her to this point, but it all felt like a blur. The storm, the attack, the separation, everything was slipping away, and all she could focus on was the warmth of the human's presence. I got lost," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I was with my people, but we were attacked, and then the storm came." The human didn't ask more questions. Instead, he motioned for her to follow him. "You won't survive out here alone. Come with me. I can help." Aliana hesitated, unsure whether she should trust him. But she was at the end of her strength, and the thought of standing in the snow any longer was unbearable. She nodded slowly and took a step forward, leaning on him for support as they made their way toward what she hoped was safety as they moved through the snow. Liana couldn't help but wonder who this human was. Why had he chosen to help her? Did he know who she was? She had no answers, only questions that floated in the cold air between them. But for now, she would follow him. She had no other choice. The wind howled as the human helped Eliana through the snow. The storm had not let up, and the cold was biting at their skin. Each step was hard, but the human moved with confidence, guiding her through the blizzard. Aliana could hardly see, the snow falling so thickly. But she kept her grip on his arm, trusting him to lead her. Alina's body felt like it was made of ice. Her legs were weak, and her head swam with dizziness. She had never felt so helpless. Before, she was royalty, trained to survive anything, to be strong and powerful in the face of adversity. But now, here she was, relying on a human to save her life. It was a bitter pill to swallow. "You doing okay?" The human's voice broke through her thoughts. She tried to nod, but her head felt too heavy. She could hardly find the strength to speak. "Why? I'll be fine," she whispered, but even to her own ears, it didn't sound convincing. The human glanced at her, his face serious. "You don't look fine. We'll stop soon. Get out of this wind." Aliana was too tired to argue. She could only focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The pain in her body was growing, her wounds from the earlier battles still fresh in her mind. She was used to pain, but this was different. The cold was seeping into her bones, and the storm felt like it would never end. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a small cave, hidden behind a wall of jagged rocks. The human pulled her inside, away from the snow and wind. It was a bit warmer here, the walls of the cave providing some shelter. The human set her down gently on the ground, his hands moving quickly as he rummaged through his pack. Aliana sat, leaning against the cold stone. Her vision blurred for a moment as the exhaustion took over. She closed her eyes, letting herself rest, even if only for a few seconds. When she opened her eyes again, Human was sitting in front of her, holding out a small canteen of water. "Drink," he said softly. She took the canteen, her hand shaking as she brought it to her lips. The water was cold, but it felt like life itself, filling her body with much-needed strength. She drank slowly, savoring every drop. When she finished, she handed it back to him, feeling a bit more alert. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. The human didn't answer immediately. He sat back, his dark eyes watching her. Aliana felt his gaze on her, but she didn't look away. She wasn't sure what to make of him. She had been taught to distrust humans. Her people had fought wars against them. But there was something different about this man. He wasn't like the others she had encountered. "You're not what I expected," he finally said, his voice quiet. Aliana raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The human leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "I didn't think I'd find someone like you out here, alone in the cold. Most of your kind, ... Well, they're not so, ... helpless. Right." Her pride flared for a moment, but she swallowed it down. He didn't mean it in an insulting way. He was simply stating what was obvious. She was weak. She was a royal. But in this moment, she was nothing more than a lost traveler. "I am not helpless," she said, her voice steady despite the weakness she felt inside. I just ... I wasn't prepared for this storm." The human gave a small nod. "Yeah, storms are hard to predict. Out here?" Aliana took a deep breath, trying to find some calm. The cold still gnawed at her, but she was grateful for the shelter. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." The human didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the ground, his face hard to read. "I don't know," he muttered. "I've spent too much time alone, I guess. I couldn't just leave you out there to die." Aliana studied him closely. There was something in his eyes. Something she couldn't quite understand. He wasn't afraid of her, wasn't even angry. He had helped her without hesitation, even when he could have easily left her to the storm. "You're different," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Most humans would have just taken me back to your people, but you didn't." The human shrugged, looking uncomfortable with the attention. "Not all humans are the same." Aliana nodded slowly. She couldn't argue with that. She had been raised to believe that all humans were enemies, that they were nothing more than obstacles in her people's path. But now, sitting in this small cave with this man, she wasn't so sure. I don't know how to repay you for what you've done, she said softly. I don't know if you even want anything in return. The human looked up at her, his face softening a little. I don't need anything. I'm just glad I found you in time. There was a long pause, and for the first time in a long while, Aliana felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future would hold or how she would get off this mountain, but at this moment, she wasn't alone. The human had saved her, and for that, she was grateful. She didn't know what would come next, but she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The cave was silent except for the sound of the wind howling outside. Aliana sat against the cool stone wall, her body beginning to warm up from the shelter of the cave. Ow. Human had built a small fire with wood he had gathered, and the crackling flames filled the space with a soft, comforting glow. She watched it for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. Alina's mind kept returning to one question. Why had the human helped her? She had been taught that humans were selfish, that they cared only for themselves and their own survival. Yet this man had put his own safety at risk to save her. He had no reason to do so, and yet he did. That made her wonder what kind of person he truly was. The human was sitting across from her, poking the fire with a stick. His face was serious, his eyes distant. He had not said much since they had taken shelter in the cave, and Aliana was not sure how to start the conversation again. You haven't told me your name? She said quietly, breaking the silence. The human paused for a moment before looking up at her. James, he replied, his voice low but steady. A simple name, Aliana noted, her lips curling into a small smile. Where are you from, James? James leaned back against the wall, staring into the flames. I'm from Earth, he said after a moment, but it feels like a lifetime ago. Aliana didn't fully understand. She had heard of Earth, of course. It was the home of humans, a planet far from her own. But she didn't know much about it beyond that. She had never cared to learn. What do you mean? She asked. A lifetime ago? James sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. Complicated. I used to be part of a military group, but after the war, I needed to get away, so I came here. This planet's quiet. I've been living alone for years. Liana felt a pang of sadness. She had always been surrounded by people, by servants, by advisors, by those who depended on her. The thought of being alone for so long was hard for her to imagine. Yet she could see how someone like James might feel the need to escape. Are you lonely? She asked softly. James looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, but it's different now, he said, his voice softer. I've had my time alone, but I've learned something. Sometimes it's better to share the silence with someone who understands. Aliana didn't fully understand what he meant, but she couldn't deny the warmth that his words brought. To her heart, she had never considered that. She had always been surrounded by people who wanted something from her, people who only saw her as the heir to the throne. To hear someone speak about sharing silence in a peaceful way was new to her. I didn't think I would find anyone out here, James continued. I came to get away from it all. But then I found you, and I guess I'm not as alone as I thought. Aliana watched him closely, wondering if he was being honest with her or if he was simply being polite. But something in his eyes made her believe him. He was not like the other humans she had known. He was different. I didn't think anyone would find me, she said quietly, looking down at her hands. Not after everything that happened. I thought I would die alone. James shook his head. No one should ever die alone. Not like that. Aliana swallowed, trying to push down the emotion rising within her. She had been taught to be strong, to never show weakness. But here in the quiet of the cave, with James sitting across from her, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: vulnerability. She looked back up at him, meeting his gaze. You saved my life, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know why you did, but I'm grateful. James didn't speak right away. Instead, he just nodded, his expression softening. I'm glad I could help, he said. But don't thank me yet. We still need to figure out how to get you off this mountain. Liana nodded, knowing he was right. They were still stuck on this treacherous glacier, and the storm outside had not let up. She had no idea how long it would last, or how much longer she could hold out. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of hope. "We'll figure it out," James added, reading her thoughts. "One step at a time." Aliana smiled at him, a small but genuine smile. "I believe you." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire providing a sense of peace that Aliana hadn't felt in a long time. She didn't know what the future would hold or how she would return to her people, but for now, she was grateful to be here with James. In this moment of quiet understanding, eventually the fire began to fade, the warmth from the flames slowly dying. Aliana stretched her tired limbs, feeling the ache in her muscles from the cold. She was still weak, but she was no longer as afraid as she had been. With James by her side, she felt a sense of security she hadn't known she could feel. "We'll rest tonight," James said, standing up and stretching. "Tomorrow, we'll make a plan." Aliana nodded and closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the calm of the cave lull her into a deep, much-needed sleep. Tomorrow, the journey would continue. But for tonight, she was safe. The morning came slowly, with the first light of dawn barely breaking through the thick clouds outside the cave. Aliana woke to the sound of wind still howling, but it was quieter now. The storm had moved on, but the cold remained, a constant reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature. She stretched, feeling the stiffness in her muscles from both the cold and the exhaustion. The fire had died during the night, leaving behind only a few smoldering embers. James was sitting nearby, his back against the cave wall, watching the outside world through the small opening. He looked calm, but Aliana could tell he was preparing for the next step. "How long do you think the storm will last?" she asked, her voice soft and still hoarse from the cold. James turned his head slightly, giving her a small smile. "The worst of it is over. The mountain might still be dangerous, but we can get out of here soon." Aliana nodded, though she didn't feel quite as confident. The mountain still felt vast and threatening, but she trusted James. He had gotten them this far. If anyone could lead them through the dangers ahead, it was him. James stood up and stretched, the muscles in his back popping as he moved. "I'll go check outside, see what we're working with. You stay here and rest." Aliana hesitated. "I should go with you, not helpless." James raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. "All right, but you're still recovering. Just keep it slow." With that, they both made their way out of the cave, stepping carefully into the cold, fresh air of the mountain. The snow was deeper than Aliana had expected, and her feet sank into it with each step. The mountain was silent now, except for the wind that still whispered across the frozen landscape. The destruction from the storm was evident. The trees were bent and broken, and the snow lay heavy on the ground. Covering everything in a thick white blanket, they walked slowly. Making their way up the mountain path, the air growing thinner as they climbed higher. James led, his movements steady, but Aliana was starting to feel the strain in her legs. The cold was starting to get to her again, seeping into her bones. She had to keep moving, though. She had no choice. They reached a ridge, and James paused. Looking out over the mountain, the view was breathtaking, but it was also dangerous. The next few hours would be critical. Aliana stood beside him, feeling the wind bite at her skin, but she didn't let herself show weakness. She was no longer the fragile, helpless princess she had been when they first met. She had survived this far, and she would survive more. James turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "We're going to have to move fast. The longer we stay out here, the more danger we're in." Aliana nodded. "I'm ready." James gave her a quick look, as if making sure she wasn't overestimating her strength. But then he gave a small nod. "All right, let's go." The path was narrow, and the snow was deep in places, making it harder to keep her footing. Alina's breath came in short gasps as they ascended, the cold air stinging her lungs. Her legs burned with each step, but she didn't stop. James, always ahead of her, kept checking behind to make sure she was still with him. He didn't say anything, but Aliana could see the concern in his eyes. She wasn't sure if it was for her safety or because he didn't want to be alone. Either way, she appreciated it. After what felt like hours, they reached the top of a steep incline. Eliana stopped for a moment, resting against a rock, her body shaking with exhaustion. James stood a little further ahead, looking down at her with a mixture of concern and patience. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but full of worry. Eliana didn't want to admit how tired she was, but the truth was, she could barely stand. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was shaky. She took a deep breath. "Just need a moment." James nodded, stepping closer. "We're almost there, I promise." The two of them rested for a few more minutes, using the brief break. To prepare for the final stretch of their journey, Eliana could feel her strength returning, the warmth of the sun beginning to seep into her skin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her moving. Once they had gathered their energy, they started again, climbing the final rise that would lead them to the base of the mountain. As they reached the top, the view below was vast and open. The snow was less thick here, and Eliana could see the outlines of the distant valley where the human had his home. She could almost taste the safety that lay ahead, but before they could start the descent, the sound of crunching snow reached their ears. James tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. "They've found us," he muttered, his tone hardening. Alina's heart skipped a beat. "The hunters," James said, his eyes scanning the area. "Be here soon. We need to move. Now." Alina's breath quickened, fear rising in her chest. She had no idea who these hunters were, but they were after her. She wasn't ready to face them. Not like this. "We have to get to cover," James said, his voice firm as he turned to face her. "Follow me." Without another word, they started. Running down the mountain, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. Alina's heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline pushing her forward. She didn't know if they could outrun the hunters, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't give up now. The sound of footsteps grew louder as Eliana and James ran down the mountain, their feet slipping on the snow and ice. The hunters were close now, and the fear in Alina's chest was growing with each passing moment. She had no idea who they were or why they were chasing her. But she knew one thing for sure, they wouldn't stop until they had her. James moved ahead, his speed and agility allowing him to stay ahead of her. He glanced over his shoulder, his face tense. "Stay close," he shouted, his voice sharp. "Don't look back, just keep running." Eliana nodded, pushing herself harder even though her body was screaming for rest. The cold air burned in. Her lungs and the muscles in her legs felt like they were made of stone. But she couldn't stop. Not now. She had come too far. They rounded a bend in the path, and James slowed down for a moment, scanning the area. Eliana caught up to him, her breath coming in short gasps. They had to make it to safety, but where was that? There was no time to figure it out now. They had to keep moving. "Where are we going?" Eliana asked, her voice shaky. James didn't answer immediately. He was still looking for a place to hide or a way to lose their pursuers. "There's a cave up ahead," he said, after a moment. "We can take shelter there for a while." Eliana nodded. Focusing on the distant, dark shape of the cave, James pointed out. It was their only hope. They picked up their pace, their feet slipping in the snow. The hunters were closing in, but James seemed to know exactly where he was going. Eliana followed closely behind, her heart racing as she pushed through the cold and exhaustion. As they neared the cave, they heard voices behind them shouting, calling to each other. The hunters were getting closer, and Eliana could hear the sounds of their footsteps in the snow, sharp and urgent. "Almost there," James called out, his voice steady despite the danger. They reached the entrance of the cave just as the hunters appeared in view, running towards them. James shoved Eliana inside, pushing her to the back of the cave as he turned to face the entrance. He grabbed a large rock and positioned it near the entrance, hoping it would be enough to slow the hunters down. "Stay down," he whispered, his eyes locked on the cave entrance. "Don't move until I say so." Eliana crouched low to the ground, her heart thumping in her chest. She didn't know what to expect from the hunters, but she knew they were dangerous. James seemed confident, but Eliana couldn't shake the fear that had settled deep within her. They waited in silence. The only sound, the wind whistling through the trees outside the cave, Aliana held her breath, trying to keep as quiet as possible. She could hear the hunters getting closer, their voices growing louder. "They're almost here," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Aliana glanced at him, her eyes wide with fear. She could see the tension in his shoulders. The way. His muscles were coiled, ready for anything. He wasn't afraid. Not like she was. He had dealt with danger before, but this was new to her. She had never been hunted like this. She was a princess, and her life had always been protected by others. Now, for the first time, she had to rely on herself and the human beside her. The footsteps outside the cave grew louder, and Alina's heart skipped a beat. The hunters were almost upon them. James tightened his grip on the rock, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Aliana could feel the tension in the air, a sense that something was about to happen then, just as the first hunter stepped into view. James threw the rock with all his strength, sending it tumbling toward the entrance. The hunter froze, his eyes widening in surprise. It was just enough to give them a moment of breathing room. "Run," James shouted, his voice full of urgency. Aliana didn't hesitate. She turned and bolted deeper into the cave, her legs moving as fast as they could. "Go." She could hear James right behind her, his footsteps matching hers as they moved further into the darkness. They needed to get away. The hunters would not give up easily. They ran for what felt like an eternity, the cave winding and twisting as they searched for a place to hide. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, but they didn't stop. James led the way, his instincts guiding them through the darkness. Finally, they reached a small, narrow tunnel. It was cramped, but it led deeper into the mountain, away from the hunters. James gestured for Aliana to follow, and she did, squeezing into the tunnel behind him. It was tight, the walls pressing in on both sides. But it was their only chance. They crawled through the tunnel in silence, the sound of their breathing the only noise in the small space. Aliana could feel the weight of the hunter's pursuit pressing down on her, but she focused on putting one hand in front of the other, moving as fast as she could. After what felt like an endless stretch of time, they finally emerged into another small cave. James stood up, wiping his hands on his clothes, and turned to look at Aliana. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft but full of concern. Aliana nodded, though she was out of breath and still shaken from the chase. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Her heart was still racing from the fear, and her legs felt like jelly. But she knew one thing for certain. She had never been so grateful for the human who had helped her. Without him, she didn't know if she would have made it. "We're safe for now," James said, his voice steady as he looked around the cave. "But we need to keep moving. We can't stay here long." Aliana nodded again, trying to steady herself. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had come to trust James, and with him by her side, she knew they could survive whatever came next. The air inside the cave was cold and still, the darkness wrapping around Aliana and James as they caught their breath. They had escaped the hunters, at least for the moment, but the danger was far from over. Lena's heart still raced, her body trembling from the fear and the cold. She had never felt so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of the world around her. James paced in the small space of the cave, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. He was still on edge, his instincts sharp as ever, but Aliana could see the tension in his posture. He was worried, and she understood why. The hunters were relentless, and they wouldn't give up until they had her. "We can't stay here long," James said, his voice low and urgent. "They'll find us eventually." "If we don't keep moving," Aliana nodded, her thoughts racing. They had to find a way out of the mountains. She couldn't stay here forever, and the longer they waited, the greater the risk of being found. "We need to get to your home," Aliana said quietly, breaking the silence. "You said it was safe." James turned to her, his expression hard. "To read, it's safe, but it's also far. We'll need to be careful." Aliana didn't question him. She trusted him, even if she didn't know what dangers lay ahead. Her mind kept returning to the hunters. She didn't know who they were or why they were after her. She knew one thing for sure: they wouldn't stop. "We can't let them catch us," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear bubbling inside her. I don't want to be a prisoner. James nodded, his jaw set in determination. We won't let that happen. They stood in silence for a moment, both of them thinking about their next move. Aliana could hear the wind howling outside, the storm still swirling above them. It was easy to feel lost in the chaos of it all, but she couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now. I've been alone for a long time, James said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I never thought I'd be helping anyone, especially not you. Aliana looked at him, her eyes softening. I'm not so different from you, she said quietly. We've both been alone. We're both fighting to survive. James looked at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in a long while. Liana could see the uncertainty in his gaze. But there was something else to a sense of understanding, connection between them that neither of them had expected. I never thought I'd trust an alien, he said with a slight, almost bitter smile. But here we are. Aliana managed a small smile in return. I never thought I'd trust a human. They both chuckled quietly, the sound light in the heavy silence of the cave. For a brief moment, the weight of their situation seemed to lift, and Aliana allowed herself to relax just a little. It felt strange, but comforting, to have someone by her side who wasn't asking for anything in return. James turned and began packing up his things, moving with the same efficiency he had shown the night before. We'll need to move quickly once we leave. I know a path through the mountains, but it's not safe. We'll have to be careful. Aliana stood up, stretching her stiff limbs. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm. We've come this far. We can't stop now. James gave her a look, as if weighing her words. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. All right, let's get going. They moved swiftly through the narrow tunnel, Aliana following James as he led the way out of the cave. The cold air hit them as they emerged into the open, but it was a different kind of cold now. It wasn't just the mountain wind, it was the coldness of their situation, the reality that they were being hunted. The urgency of it all was pressing down on them, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The mountain path they were on was steep and treacherous. Alina's legs burned with each step, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to. James, a few steps ahead, kept checking behind them, his eyes always scanning for danger. As they reached the base of the mountain, the path became even more narrow and difficult to navigate. The snow was deep here, and the wind howled even louder. Aliana could barely see ahead, but James moved with purpose, showing no signs of hesitation. How far is it? She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. A couple of hours, James replied. We'll have to move fast. They pressed on, their pace quickening as the path grew steeper. Lena's heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling like an eternity. The mountain seemed endless, but she kept going, knowing that the human beside her was the only reason she was still alive. Finally, after what felt like hours, James stopped, holding up a hand to signal Aliana to stop. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the area. The wind had died down, but the danger still loomed. This is it, James said. We're almost there. Just need to cross this last stretch. Liana nodded, exhaustion making. It hard to think clearly, but they were so close. She could feel it. They were almost there, almost to safety. Suddenly, there was a sound behind them, a crunching of snow. James froze, his body tensing. Alina's heart skipped a beat. Hunters were close. Alina's heart raced as she heard the footsteps behind them, the sound of snow crunching beneath heavy boots. James froze, his body tense and alert. He turned slightly, looking at Aliana with a warning in his eyes. She knew what he was thinking. They couldn't be caught now. It's not after everything they had been through. Stay close to me, James whispered. His voice barely audible over the wind. It was already starting to move again, his steps silent but quick. Aliana followed, her breath shallow as she pushed herself forward. The hunters were close. She could feel it. They crept along the narrow path, the wind howling louder as if trying to warn them of the danger ahead. The snow seemed to move with them, the cold seeping into their clothes. It was as if the mountain itself was alive, watching, waiting. Alina's pulse was loud in her ears, and she focused on James, determined not to lose sight of him. The sound of footsteps behind them, grew louder, closer. Aliana glanced over her shoulder and saw the shadows of the hunters emerging from the fog. They were fast and they were gaining ground. "Run," James shouted, his voice urgent. "And we need to get to cover." Aliana didn't hesitate. Turned and ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder than before. The snow was deeper here, and each step felt like a struggle. Her muscles screamed, but she ignored it. She had no choice but to keep moving. James was ahead of her, his form steady and sure, cutting through the snow like he had done this 1,000 times before. Aliana followed, her feet slipping in the snow, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The hunters were closing in, their footsteps pounding behind her. The sound was getting closer, and panic threatened to rise in her chest. "Don't look back," James called, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Just keep running." Aliana bit her lip and focused on his voice. She couldn't look back. If she did, it would only slow her down. She had to trust James. He knew this mountain. He knew how to survive. They pushed forward, nearing a small rocky outcrop. James made a sharp turn toward it, signaling for Aliana to follow. She could barely keep up, but she pushed herself, the adrenaline making her legs move faster than they ever had before. They reached the outcrop. Just as the first of the hunters appeared behind them, their figures emerging from the mist like dark shapes. James quickly crouched behind a large boulder, pulling Aliana down beside him. "Stay low," he whispered, his breath coming in short gasps. Alina's heart was pounding in her chest, but she did as he said. They both remained perfectly still, hidden behind the rocks. The hunters passed by without seeing them, their figures disappearing into the fog. As they continued their search, Aliana didn't dare move until she was sure they were gone. She waited, her body tense, her eyes fixed on James. He was breathing hard, his face pale from the exertion, but his eyes were focused, calculating. He had a plan. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way he studied the landscape. After a few moments, James slowly stood, motioning for Aliana to follow. "We can't stay here. They'll keep looking for us. We need to move." Aliana nodded, her legs still trembling from the run. She pushed herself to her feet, grateful for the brief moment of rest, but knowing they had to keep going. The hunters were still out there, and they were getting closer. James led the way. Taking a different path that wound around the edge of the mountain, Aliana followed, keeping her eyes on his every move. The wind was colder here, and the snow deeper, but James seemed to know exactly where he was going. He moved with purpose, not stopping to rest, not even glancing back to see if Aliana was keeping up. For a moment, Aliana felt a pang of doubt. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up. Her body was exhausted, her muscles sore from the constant movement. But she couldn't let herself fall behind. She had to keep going. They reached a small ledge overlooking a valley. The view was breathtaking, but there was no time to enjoy it. James quickly crouched down behind a rock, signaling for Aliana to do the same. "I know a way down into the valley," James said, his voice low. "It's dangerous, but it's the fastest way to safety." Aliana looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She could see the seriousness in his face. He was taking a risk, and so was she.
Ow.
But there was no other choice. He couldn't afford to waste time. She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." James didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, slipping down the side of the ledge with ease. Aliana followed, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the rocks for support. The ground below was unstable, and the snow was slick. But James kept a steady pace, showing her exactly where to step. The climb down was difficult. But after what felt like hours, they finally reached the valley floor. James stood up, dusting off the snow from his clothes. He looked around, scanning the area for any signs of danger. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said, his voice tense. "But we have a better chance here." Aliana nodded, her eyes scanning the valley. It was quiet, too quiet. The hunters could still be out there, and they weren't safe yet. But for now, they had made it out of the worst of the mountain, and that was enough.